Hey everyone, this is Greg Zumak at Ivy Futures on Twitter, and one of the co-founders and writers at Northside Bound, which is kind of your one-stop shop for all things Cubs minor league and MLB draft kind of content. And just kind of trying something different. We've been doing a March Q&A regularly, or a monthly Q&A on the site pretty regularly about the MLB draft. We've also got lots of prospect roundtables, and myself and Todd Johnson have been writing about the MLB draft on Northside Bound pretty regularly, but just kind of trying something a little bit different here. And just as an opportunity to kind of touch base on some MLB draft content, some people on Twitter sent me some questions. I'm happy to jump into them. It's still fairly early in the draft cycle, but I think that there's enough information there that we can kind of do a little bit of a deeper dive on a few prospects. And so, just kind of looking forward to that. The first thing I want to kind of jump into is we had a few different questions that are all related to, all right, who's going to be in that top seven mix? And I'm sure seven is picked pretty intentionally in that conversation because that's where the Cubs are picking here in the 2022 draft, seventh overall. And so getting a lot of questions about like who's going to be in that top seven, and then alongside that, where do the Cubs maybe go? Again, very early in the content, in the cycle. But we had a few questions. I want to give a shout out to at Thomas J Witt, who asked the question of, with what looks like a clear top seven, do Jed and Carter stick with best player available in the first round, or is there a Schwarber type underslot lurking out there? Signing bonuses, expectations, overall draft demands. I know I've said it's early already, but it really is early, and so much so that a lot of those demands aren't even getting finalized until maybe a few days in the draft, before the draft, as far as when individuals can kind of talk with their advisors, through back channels or officially or whatever, can have discussions with scouts and executives with the teams. These decisions really aren't coming into play yet. I think players certainly have ideas, right? I mean, you can imagine that a few players who have very significant college commitments, such as like Vanderbilt, are difficult to sign. I'm sure they are, but everybody's got kind of a number in mind. Right now, those aren't finalized because you could have players have a massive surge, and maybe their price right now is 1.25 million, but they look like a first round pick pretty solidly in the top 15, and now their baseline's 3. It's really not uncommon for that to happen. And without getting too much into specifics about signability, there are also players, and I remember having conversations with a few individuals, I'll just say that, last year, where that demand was different for each team that they were kind of talking with, and that player ended up going in the top 20 picks or so, but their number was going to be different for each individual team. And so that's all really very individual right now, and very up in the air. So I think the big question, though, is there a potential signability option? And I think the Cubs are opportunistic. They're going to be viewing, which is, I love that approach, by the way. Just let whatever talent you want there kind of fall into your laps. In 2020, it was Ed Howard, and he's still kind of growing into his time in the minor leagues. Last year's Jordan Wicks. Neither of those players were necessarily expected to be there. I think Ed Howard was a little bit more of a toss-up, but he was heavily being discussed at the Angels pick. And then I think he could have been the White Sox pick had Garrett Crochet not been on the board. Jordan Wicks wasn't expected to be there, and the Cubs snapped him up. What adds a little bit of a wrinkle to it is that there are some new draft changes in the CBA that may affect their overall style and moves at pick 7, but also at picks 1 through 6. And that is the fact that players are likely, there's going to be a minimum of a 75% of the cut of the draft slot that you have to offer a player. So you're not likely to be able to take a massive, massive deep cut. The Orioles are picking at 1, and they have to effectively offer a minimum of 75% as long as that player goes through the pre-draft physical. So 75% of the top pick is still pretty high, but 75% of the Cubs slot is, a significant savings, but it's not something that you can spread out and add a million here and a million there and a million there. So I will say that I think that there are some players that this could make sense with. I won't get too much into signability now, and I'm not speaking as a topic expert at the moment as far as specific players, but I think that with the strength of the draft being a really deep line of college hitting, that yeah, you could totally, if you felt like you had a lot of players grouped into a similar category, and you were able to get one for 3.9 million versus somebody at 4.8 or 5, then sure, I think that that would make a lot of sense. We just may not see those deep cuts like we did last year. We may not see the Kansas City Royals picking Frank Mazzucato and then dropping 3+ million uh, to Ben Gardner. We just may not see that this year. So it is an interesting wrinkle. I think it's a fair perspective and something that could happen with the Cubs. I'll get to who I think they may be, who might check a lot of boxes at number 7 here pretty soon. And I'll be releasing my mock draft here fairly soon as well. But yeah, I mean, I think it's fair. I wouldn't say, Thomas, and I appreciate the question. I wouldn't say that there's a clear top 7 right now. In fact, I think there's a lot of mobility with that. I certainly have a good 8-10 players that I really like, and I feel like are graded out stronger than some of the others. But there's a lot of time to make up. So I hear what you're saying, and I appreciate the question. I think we could see the Cubs go a few different ways. Hopefully, you keep tuning in for some of the mock draft stuff that I've got going on here. Along those same lines, great question from @JimmyNewDC. Who's always a loyal reader, and so I appreciate it very much. But one of the big questions that he has is, now that there have been some games played, what do you see as the biggest overall strength of the 2022 MLB Draft? So he mentions high school bats, high school pitching, college bats, or college pitching, and then what is the weakest area? Jimmy, always appreciate the content, always appreciate you following, reading, and interacting with us. So you break down the 4 different demographics: high school bats, high school pitching, college bats, college pitching. So I'm going to jump right off and just say that the weakest out there is college pitching. It's not a surprise to a lot of people who follow the content. The college pitching class is not very strong, and it's really, really, really struggled this year. Part of that is due to injuries. You've seen Landon Sims go down. Adam Mayer is not necessarily down with Tommy John, but he's also not doing great, and he was kind of a pop-up arm there. We've seen a host of other guys get hurt. Peyton Pallett is already down. There's just a bunch of them, and the class is really, really struggling with that. We also see a suspension adding in there. Carson Wisenhunt was getting some, kind of low-key hype as maybe the top left-hander in the entire class, maybe even the top college pitcher in the entire class. And, I'm not going to put too much stock into accidentally or not taking a performance-enhancing drug. And it's really hard to parse out how teams are going to feel about that. He still had a great arm. It's not like he is injured. I would favor taking him over an injured player, as far as a risk profile. But he's going to be somebody that may not go as high just because of that situation. And then you're already talking about the fact that the class was not very strong to begin with. Really, this class was hoping and dreaming that somebody was going to take a massive step forward. Perhaps that person was going to be Blake Tidwell, or Landon Sims, both with electric right arms, but now with injuries that are going to prevent that likely from happening. It's a class that really is begging for somebody to take a step forward. College pitching is something that a lot of teams do crave. There's some safety and security with that demographic. And so there are going to be some teams that do rank that higher. There are also going to be a lot of teams that, when we look at what the strength of the class is, I think that there's going to be a little bit of diverging opinions. My personal view right now, it's the high school bats carrying it. Part of that is when you talk to people around and I'm not talking to, dozens and dozens and dozens of people or anything like that, but when you talk to people around, Drew Jones is now really taking a massive step forward as far as how teams view him. And whether he goes 1-1 or not is kind of not really the point. It's all going to be strategies and how teams want to use their bonus pools, but he's taken a big step forward. Tamar Johnson has what some people view as a generational hit tool, somebody that people haven't seen that kind of profile since Joe Mauer. That's what Jim Callis was saying. That's 20 plus years ago. And that's a pretty big statement to make. We've had players obviously have incredible tools. Like, he's not Bryce Harper in what he does, but that's a pretty big statement to make as far as a high school bat. So Tamar Johnson could have the best hit tool that we've seen in 2 decades. And then you start talking about a few different other high school players, one of which is Elijah Green, who I've been pretty vocal about the fact that I've been very concerned about his whiffs. He has some swing and miss, and he chased the ball pretty badly last summer as well. The physical tools are unbelievable, though, and I can say this: this is draft guru Mason McRae, who, if you follow the draft content, you want to get involved in that at all, you absolutely should be following him. He has unbelievable access and breakdowns of players. I would trust his rankings with almost anybody out there. And Mason's been very vocal about the fact that, um, he kind of dropped that Elijah Green kind of reminds him of uh, Dylan Cruz, who's going to be probably the presumptive 2023 number one overall player. And Dylan Cruz could have gone easily in the first round a couple years ago, and he decided to go to LSU, probably because he wasn't getting the offers that he wanted. I'm not sure the teams are willing to make the same mistake here. And yes, Elijah Green has some swing and miss. And I also realized too that I jumped into Elijah Green, and I appreciate it. I actually had another question, so I want to give a shout out to at William Ao Wang. Appreciate you, William, asking this question. So I'll kind of jump in there with Elijah Green right now. But I think the biggest question that William had too is, has the swing and miss kind of quieted down? And it has to a certain extent. I think he has actually made some minor swing adjustments. The biggest thing with him is, even if he whiffs a little bit or above average, more than most, that's still okay. What you want it is not to be in such a catastrophic level. And his levels were pretty rough in the showcase circuit. Like, I don't want to make any, grand statements, but when we talk about contact rate, James Triantos, I talked a ton about his contact rate last year, is 94%. It was unbelievably high. He just didn't swing and miss on the showcase circuit. And I don't want to use specific numbers for Elijah Green, but they were in like the 60s. So he swung and missed a lot, like 30%, 30 plus percent. He also chased the ball, so he chased bad pitches. So he chased bad pitches out of the zone, and he swung and missed inside and outside the zone. So that's a big concern. He's made some adjustments. And for a team that feels like we can live with some whiffs, while also we feel like he's on an upward trajectory, they just may not be able to pass that up. His power and speed are just unbelievable. And this is a guy that, I don't know, if you set him up at linebacker on the Bears, I don't think he would be a fish out of water. And yet he plays a pretty good center field, and he'll probably move to a corner at some point, but he's got the chops to do it. So, to get to Williams' second part of his question, which is, could he fall to the Cubs at 7? I honestly don't think so anymore. And I had Elijah Green sitting outside of the top 10. So, I'm talking about the strength of the draft, and I do feel like it's the high school bats. You've got those 3 guys, and then you have a few other players taking a step up, one of which is Jackson Holliday, and I'll definitely talk about him a little bit more. There's also another viewpoint that maybe the college bats are pretty good. And so college bats, when we talk about safety and risk, they have a low level of risk. First round college bats hit at the pro level, by and large. There's some misses every once in a while, but if you're taking a guy fairly high in the college draft, or college bat in the draft, you're feeling generally pretty good that that's going to be a pretty good chance that that's a big leaguer. The Cubs heavily built on that. Chris Bryant, Kyle Schwarber, and Ian Happ, they all made it to the major leagues, and they've all had success too. I mean, they've had, you know, some MVP Rookie of the Year, uh, legendary Cub status, and Chris Bryant. Others have, All-Star game, positive WAR players. These are players that they've had it. Yeah, you would have liked a little bit more from Ian Happ and Cal Schwarber during his time, but at the end of the day, those were very successful picks. Cubs built very heavily on that. Part of the fact that when you drafted them, you felt very good that they're major leaguers. And so some teams are going to put a, a higher coefficient, a higher multiplier, however you want to view that, in their draft models to add to that security of a college bat. And so some teams are going to have very model heavy drafts in which they lean really, really tightly on these algorithms, these assessments, to say we're going to likely prioritize college bats. That doesn't mean that they're going to pick. That doesn't mean they're going to pass up a generational high school talent to pick a college bat, but we're going to see a higher push for that. And so there are some players like Brooks Lee is off to a phenomenal start. He boasts incredible exit velocities, good contact. He makes good decisions. He should be able to stick on the infield pretty well. I don't know if he's a shortstop. He's probably a third baseman, but looks really good at doing it. And he can hang with any of the guys at the top few. So we're going to see players like Brooks Lee. I don't know if we're going to see Chase Delar. I'll get into him in a little bit. Another player that I really think is going to get some really high push is actually Dylan Beavers out of Cal. In fact, as I look forward to my mock draft that's going to be coming up and asking around to a few different people, it wouldn't surprise me to actually have him in the top 5, and I think that he's got a pretty good case to even be a consideration at 1-1. Jace Young, isn't having quite as strong of a year. Kevin Prada, Daniel Susak, we will talk about. And so there's still a very good group of college bats, and it's a pretty deep group. So I think it's just what's best in this class, like what's the strength of this draft, all goes into, are you talking about future superstars? Are you talking about this guy's a major leaguer? Because yes, I do still think the guys at the top, like Drew Jones, Tamar Johnson, are definitely major leaguers, but it's shooting for the moon there. We're saying in 4 years, we expect this player to put up 3.5 wins every single year for the next 5. And I think you'd be hard pressed for some teams not to go that route. So the bats are the strength, in my opinion. I'd lean high school bats, but I think that there are some teams that are really, really impressed with the college hitting. So that's what I'll say. High school arms, we've got a few standouts, and I would say that, yeah, you've got your top guys. I'm more intrigued with the second, third, fourth round high school arms, to be honest. I think that there's just some real interesting players. Humphreys out of North Carolina is a lefty high school guy that I think is really, really good. He's showing 4 pitches. His stuff's taken up. Maybe he's a first rounder, but I think he's kind of towards the back end of the first round, second round. And so, I'd say the strength of the class is still the bats, but there's some intriguing high school arms. The college pitching, there will be some teams that do really like some guys, but we're probably not going to see too many arms go up top. And that's kind of where I'll leave it there. But as far as actually thinking about a few different guys that could be with that overall selection for the Cubs, at Shytown34M asked the question of, do you see Kevin Parada moving into the top 5? And if he makes it to 7, do you like that fit for the Cubs? So I'm really debating on where I think Kevin Parada's kind of situated. But I will say that his bat is really impressive, and he's done absolutely everything you could ask for him to do so far this year. Kevin Parada is a college catcher. He's out of Georgia Tech, and he's actually a draft-eligible sophomore. But what's definitely interesting about Kevin Parada is the fact that he was a pretty good bat last year, top 15, 20 bat. in the college ranks. Good contact. It's not spectacular, but it's like upper 70%. Um, didn't really chase the ball that badly. He kind of made some chase, but not a terrible number there. And he had some great power. What he's done this season so far is take that all a pretty significant step forward. And the question is whether you think he's going to be a college bat. I mean, sorry, a catcher at the next level. And I'll tell you this, that I'm sure there are some teams that don't really care. He has some athleticism, so that you could potentially play him other places. It's very similar to Henry Davis last year, where he kind of came in with the, maybe picks into the 20s, maybe a little bit higher, to, yeah, you just really can't pass on this bat. And to me, he always made the most sense for the Pirates last year at 1-1. I mocked him there shortly before the draft. And he just made the most sense. I think there's going to be a team up very high that looks at Kevin Prada in the same way. It doesn't really matter if they've got a catcher set up. So, like the Baltimore Orioles, they have Rushman, but who cares? I mean, honestly, like you can have Kevin Prada. If they just feel Kevin Prada is the best combination of signability to go along with the bat and makeup and all that, maybe it just doesn't matter. And you just take him at 4, and sure, he could play a little catcher, or you could just slide him into the outfield or first base or whatever. I think that that's pretty fair. If he makes it to the 7, could he be a pick for the Cubs? Sure. I think that that's certainly a consideration. I haven't zeroed in on that. I haven't spoken with anybody specifically with the Cubs on Parada, but I think that that's certainly fair that he could. I would be fine with it. He's been moving up my rankings. But in full disclosure, when I look at my rankings, I do have some significant positional adjustments in there. And so I still have a guy like Daniel Susac ranked higher than Kevin Parada. I do. And part of that is the fact that Susac has looked absolutely fantastic at catcher, and he's hitting pretty well. Now, he's not hitting Kevin Parada level, but he's hitting very well. And to me, I think Susac could still be a top 10 pick in this draft, and that really would not surprise me. We'll see when we finally get really into like heavy conference play, but that wouldn't shock me barring any health issues. So I think that you've got a guy like Daniel Susac, you've got a guy like Kevin Parada. A lot of these names can certainly make sense there. So thank you very much for the question. Obviously, I appreciate that. He's had a great start to the year. Unfortunately, and I won't be able to list the whole name here, but user 18259, etc., etc. Thank you very much for the question. But they ask how much is DeLauder, so Chase DeLauder stock dropped after a bad start to the season. So I will say first and foremost that I started the year with Chase DeLauder as my 1-1. I haven't moved him off of there yet. I am considering that right now. I think Brooks Lee has done enough to actually do that. Brooks Lee, Tamar Johnson, and Chase DeLauder were all 60s for me as far as my future performance grade, which is similar to future value, but it's not technically the same ranking. There are some differences in there. But kind of in my draft model, they all ranked right there. And yes, Drew Jones is probably doing enough to move into that. I need to take another look on how I view that. But Brooks Lee is probably 1-1 for me here fairly soon. But I haven't really yet moved Chase DeLauder out of that 60 tier. He might be getting there. But I have to say, I'm actually not as concerned about the performance. So much was made. It was like the tiniest sample, but so much was made about the fact that Chase DeLauder faced 2 of the best college arms in days 1 and 2. So we're talking about like you're going from inter-team scrimmages to holy crap, you're facing 2 first-rounders at FSU in Parker Messick and Bryce Hubbard, who actually have ranked in the top 10 overall. And they made him look foolish. They're both really impressive lefties with multiple pitches, some sweeper sliders between the 2 of them. And they made him look foolish. Like he K'd a bunch of times. It's a lefty on lefty matchup, and it didn't really go well. It was also the only baseball around. So we weren't even talking about spring training coming up. It was the lockout. And everybody was fixated on the fact that Chase DeLauder's getting a bunch of run and he's getting just eaten up by two first round arms. I think a lot was made out of that. Since then, Chase DeLauder is absolutely mashed, and he's stopped K'ing. He's hit for power. He's hit for pretty decent contact. Is he 1-1? I don't know. Maybe he's not, but I think he's not that far off. What I'm more concerned about is he has been injured recently, mostly fluky injuries. Hit his shoulder running out in the outfield, and got hit in the head too. And so he's kind of been out a little bit. He's been banged up. That's honestly a little bit more of a concern for me than how he faced. If you told me if you had Chase DeLauder whiffing against Bryce Hubbard in the minor leagues in 2 years, I'm honestly not that concerned about it. Even if he's a little bit more of a platoon bat, he's the strong side of a platoon. Again, that's not really 1-1, but I don't think he's going to fall that far. So I totally think he's a first rounder. I know we had Kylie McDaniel talk about, reminded him of Cam Miser. I see what he means. I don't agree with that. And I mean, Kylie's great at what he does. I'm just saying, like, I personally don't agree with that. Kylie's always been a little bit further down on Chase DeLauder than some of the others, and that's totally fine. He's got experience evaluating prospects and stuff. The other thing with DeLauder is the fact that some people just don't like his swing. Others view it as perfect. And so it's about as polarizing as you can get. So some people absolutely hate that. He's got like a kickback leg that goes out oftentimes when he swings. He's not the only one. There's definitely he's not alone in that swing style, but some people just absolutely hate it. And then there's others who think this is like a picture perfect swing. His angle at the point of contact is excellent. His successes, he has displayed contact and power and athleticism in his swing, and he mashed on the Cape Cod League, which is a really good factor. It weighs heavily into how I view prospects as well, especially college prospects. So, I think he already was somewhat polarizing. He has a little bit of injuries, and what I kind of think is that at some point somebody's going to get just a really good steal. Not that far down in the draft, but far enough. Could it be the Cubs? Maybe. I think that's fair if that's kind of your natural next question. But yeah, Chase DeLauder is. I'm still fairly high on him, though. Full transparency, last year I had Jed Fabian as my 1-1 for far too long. This is my first year officially doing that last year. And I had him on for long. So I don't know if I've cursed people. Hopefully not. So if you really love a prospect, I guess maybe don't have me pick him 1-1 in the preseason. But I don't see the same issues that happened to DeLauder, or that happened to Fabian, happened to DeLauder. It's a completely different situation. And I think he still gets drafted fairly high for somebody who likes the swing changes, and they don't mind that at all. So thanks very much, of course, for your question. Really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. One of the next questions that I had is from @BarryMotivates. How do you think the upcoming, I think that's what you meant there, banning of the shift will affect drafting, particularly when it comes to shortstops? Man, Barry, what a question. That is so good, because I bet there's a lot of conversations that are happening right now internally related to that. And I'll tell you that I do think it affects it, but I don't think it's as much of an issue as it would be years ago. And so my thought process on this is the fact that, yes, the shift is going to go away in all likelihood in some capacity, but defensive positioning isn't necessarily. And so we make a lot of deal about the shift. You have a lefty hitter and you pretty much overload the entire right side of the infield. And so anybody who pulls the ball just gets sucked up right there. You've got, your first baseman, second baseman, shortstop, and maybe even your third baseman's up the middle at that point. You just kind of take the entire half of the infield out. Okay, well, that's an extreme shift. And it definitely allows you to play players that you wouldn't traditionally think about as suiting up in the middle of the infield. And it allows you to play them pretty easily in those spots. So Barry asked a great question of like, well, how does that affect how we view shortstops? But I'll tell you that defensive positioning can still occur though. And teams spend a lot of time and energy and resources on trying to find out where to play players. Now, some of that includes the shift, but others it doesn't. And so you can still put hitters, second basemen, shortstops, or whatever, in the best positions that you feel you can to maximize their defensive abilities, minimize their deficiencies. The player that I think about this the most is probably Tamar Johnson, because he's got really good hands. He's very smooth. I don't think he's a shortstop long term, and there are some people that might disagree with that, but in general, he's viewed as like a second baseman at the next level. It's a really weird demographic. It's not something you see that often, especially really up high school second baseman. But he's still very smooth, and he's got good hands and can throw the ball. People just generally feel he's going to outgrow shortstop. It's not easy to play shortstop, and so he will likely outgrow it. And so this probably affects how people view Termarr, because if you still had this shift, you can kind of just keep him at second base and really give yourself a lot of options there, or shortstop even. And I do think this can affect that. At the end of the day, though, with so many unknowns, high school shortstops and some of the other shortstops, let's say Brooks Lee, for instance, who's a shortstop now, but probably a third baseman, there is still so much athleticism that comes with even just playing shortstop right now. And yes, Brooks Lee is probably a third baseman. Yes, Tamar Johnson is probably a second baseman. But there's still something to be said for being the person on the field who your team views as the best defender. And that's usually the shortstop on these high school and college teams. And so there's still so much benefit of drafting those athletes, because you put Brooks Lee over to third base, yeah, without the shift, he probably ends up there. Tamar Johnson probably ends up at second base without the shift. But you're still talking about, yes, but they could be pretty good there. I don't know if Tamar is going to be a plus defensive second baseman. I would lean more closer to like average, especially without the shift. But Brooks Lee could be above average at third base. And so, yes, it affects it. And I think it's a great question. I don't know the extent of it. And I don't know that a lot of teams know the extent of it either. But wow, like I really do think that, these players could still be very good, but we don't quite know how every team is going to change that in their draft model. So really fantastic question, Barry. I appreciate it so much. The next question that I had here is, where's a realistic landing spot for Kumar Rocker? And I don't know. That was from at Aaron Wilder _ and thank you. So Aaron, I'm not sure where Kumar Rocker ends up. I really am not. There's only a handful of teams that have taken a guy who was injured that previous year, Tommy John surgery or whatever. And Kumar hasn't had that. He is throwing, but he's kind of an unknown. And there was something in that physical that made the Mets walk away. We can go up and down about whether that was fair, whether that should have happened, whether the Mets made a mistake on that. I don't know, and I'm not going to get into that necessarily. But there was something that had to have been there to make teams walk away. There's a ton of rumors, totally unsubstantiated, about what it is. I don't know what it is. I've heard different things, and I'm just not going to comment on it because I'm not sure. So where does he end up? Well, I do think that there's a few teams that might make a little bit more sense. One of the teams that has shown a willingness to take some bigger risks with college pitching, whether that be injuries or future injury risk, is the Toronto Blue Jays. They took Gunnar Hoagland last year, and they've taken Nate Pearson before. I think that there's a lot of sense that Kumar makes for them. For one, and I don't love this, you just got to take the best player that you view on the board. but they are in contention. And Kumar Rucker, as long as he's healthy, is not going to take that long in the minors. He's an advanced arm. I don't think he's an ace. And even last year when we were talking about Jack Leiter versus Kumar Rocker, it wasn't very close to me. And it wasn't close to a lot of people either. Jack Leiter has more potential. But Kumar Rocker's a really high floor arm that still has a lot of really good qualities to him. Like, he's very good. I didn't love the shape of his fastball, but I mean, his breaking ball's pretty impressive. That slider, that changeup, they can play. They're really good. And this is a guy that probably doesn't spend that much time in the minors. So to me, Toronto makes the most sense. That's where I'll be mocking him in the next draft. And I think he just fits very, very well there. There are some other teams that could make sense. If Rocker falls all the way to the Yankees, that could certainly work out as well. But that's probably like that would be where I would zero in. Really would. So we've got another couple questions that all really get to where do the Cubs go at 7? And I'll tell you, I mean, I don't have it all zeroed in, obviously. We're pretty far away from that. But there's definitely some players that have caught my eye. I've been really high on Cam Collier since the beginning of the season. And for anybody who doesn't know Cam, first of all, he's a great kid. He's Lou Collier's son. But I think he's working his way to be the person that people just know him as Cam Collier. And 17 years old, he was set to be in the 2023 draft. And like James Triantos did the year before, who was supposed to be in the 2022 draft, Cam reclassified to be in the 2022 draft. And so Cam moved up a level effectively. That's always a risky situation. There's a lot that goes into those decisions. But he and his family and his advisor felt like, he's got the chops for it. Even as a 16-year-old, he was hitting, and he had a 75% contact rate on the showcase circuit. That's not all world. It's not what James Torontos did at 94% as a really young kid, but it's pretty decent. And it's better than some of the other high school bats that are probably going to be taken pretty high up there. He showed a lot of athleticism. He's playing shortstop, but I think most people view him as a third baseman, and that's where he's playing now. But what was even more of a bold statement was that he not only reclassified, he moved up to junior college. So he graduated earlier, enrolled in junior college, and plays for Chippewa, which is one of the best junior college programs in the nation. That's a really bold thing to do. Really bold thing to do. And he's earning it. He's hitting really, really well. He definitely had some swing and miss early in the season. I think that's quieted down a little bit. And he's improved the ability. At one point he's had more walks than Ks. I think it's right around there now. But he's doing really fantastically. And I think Cam Collier is going to go up fairly high. I see him all over the place in rankings. Like, some people view him in the 20s. I think he's a top 10 player. And I don't know if he's necessarily going to end up in the top 10, but I think he absolutely is a possible guy to consider there. Could he be taken by the Cubs early? I think it's fair. The Cubs have placed a really big emphasis on athleticism. Makeup is huge as well. And the ability to hit. There's also some kind of level of security in the players that they draft fairly early. And so I think Cam Collier has to be a name to kind of consider with the Cubs fairly early at 7. I would be completely fine with it. I would be absolutely stoked. But there are also some other players in the class that make a ton of sense. If a guy like Brooks Lee falls for whatever reason, provided there's not like big injuries or makeup issues, Brooks Lee would be fantastic at 7. He'd be really fantastic a few picks before that too. So, don't get your hopes up too much on that. But the shortstop, probable third baseman from Cal Poly is a guy that he could have gotten drafted fairly early in the 2019 draft. And he even came to Wrigley Field. The Cubs were very interested in him. That was a different scouting director at the time, so I can't speak to anything related to like how the org still feels about him. But I'd say that I would feel pretty comfortable saying that there's vast majority of teams that are very high on Brooks Lee Only a handful of them will likely get the opportunity to draft him. But the Cubs could be one of them. I wouldn't bank on it, but they could be. Could Chase Stellato make sense? Yeah, I think he could. I don't know how the Cubs feel about his swing. I know that I talked to a lot of people who really like it though, and there's a ton of security in his profile. He's maybe a center fielder, but probably a corner outfielder. He hits for contact. He hits for power. He's hit with wood. He doesn't go to a big school, so that's maybe his only knock on him. But he's still a guy that is super compelling. And if he landed at 7, that would be fantastic. And then I've mentioned a few other college bats, something like Kevin Prada, Daniel Susac, and Gavin Cross will get some chops. I want to give a big shout out to Nick Van Thompson, who's a big fan of Gavin Cross out there for good reason. I think Gavin Cross has done a lot of really good things. He's an outfielder, Virginia Tech, and he's hitting very, very well. He's even actually hit off lefties, which is pretty impressive as well. And I think that he's somebody to watch there. And Dylan Beavers, I've mentioned him too. The more I think about it, the more I think he fits very well with the Baltimore Orioles at 1-1 even. So if he's sitting there at 7, I think that's fine. Dylan Beavers is probably one of the few players that had the kind of contact rate and low chase rate combined with some decent exit velocities out there. There's just not a ton of those players. What's interesting about that is that Dylan Beavers did have a pretty high K percentage, high in relation, not as high as like a Jed Fabian last year, nowhere near that, but higher, a little bit higher than you'd like, and he's made some improvements there, and so I think that that's going to be something where if that continues to trickle down, then you feel pretty good about it. So Dylan Beavers is somebody that I think makes a lot of sense there. The next one is the one that he gets named so many times in mock drafts. I totally get it. I understand the background. Dylan Lesko. I don't see it. I love Dylan Lesko now. I really do. I think he's a tremendous player. If he's there at 7 and he's healthy, I think the Cubs would have to consider him. I just don't think he lasts that far. His stuff has taken a significant step forward, and it was already very good. But the big issue with Lesko heading into the season was all about the fastball shape. It was more like pretty good than, oh, wow. And he was beating hitters pretty well, especially when it comes to the high school talent that he's facing, even premier high school talent. 94, 96 up the letters is still really hard to hit. It doesn't matter if you're one of the premier high school bats in the country. It's still hard to hit. But it's less hard to hit for college guys, and it's less hard to hit for pro guys. And so what you want is to have it have really good ride up in the zone. And Lesko's is more like pretty good than what he's been showing fairly recently, which is upper level stuff. And his changeup is wicked, and his breaking balls absolutely can play. I just don't see him lasting very long. I've got him mocked to 3rd to Texas, actually, and I just don't see him lasting very long. So yeah, if he's on the board, I think the Cubs have to be interested, but just not very confident on that. Again, so much can change. It doesn't really matter. A mock draft in March doesn't really mean anything when we get to July. But as far as the current trajectory, that's how I feel about it. The last guy I really want to spend some time talking about is Jackson Holliday, because Jackson Holliday is a Matt Holliday's son, but also making a name for I Just Want to Be Jackson Holliday, and his younger brother Ethan's actually really good too. But Jackson Holliday is a shortstop at Stillwater, Oklahoma, and he is really, really, really good. Coming into the year, I just had heard chatter that there was some swing and miss to his game, and he's still growing into his game, and he's kind of a name to watch, but he's not upper tier guy. And that, with all due respect, I think a lot of that was not quite as strong of a characterization as it should be, because I ended up going back and charting every single at bat that was publicly available for Jackson Holliday in the showcase circuit last year. He had a 90.8% contact rate, so he didn't have swing and miss. He has, as of now, the top contact rate that I found for players. And what I end up having to do is I just chart every single at bat, and so it's very possible that there's a few players that are above that, but that 90.8% is pretty spectacular. Again, when we talk about contact rate, James Triantos was a bit of a, this is Fangraph's term, a freak, contact freak, at 94%. 92% was Will Taylor last year. Those are kind of some of the upper level numbers there. This year, Mikey Romero was at like 89%. Brady Neal was pretty high. And actually, Brady Neal wasn't as high. Sorry about that. I'm kind of going based on the spreadsheet that I have. But the guy who really stands out to me is Jackson Holliday. And not only does he have contact, this is not some weak slap hitting prospect, which I really like Mikey Romero. He's starting to drive the ball more, but that's some of the concerns with him is it's more of a slappy profile. He's still going to grow into some power, but that's more of like how he's getting his contact. And again, I'm still pretty high on Mikey. But Jackson Holliday is not that situation. He's driving the ball. He's driving the ball in front of pretty big audiences as far as teams. And he's displaying athleticism that he can probably stick it short. I really like Jackson Holliday. And I don't know about how necessarily the Cubs feel about him, but he happens to check off a tremendous amount of boxes that they look at. So they look at a lot of security up high early in the draft. Well, a high contact rate does that. High school shortstops, the top high school shortstops, the general safety of that profile is pretty incredible. The top high school shortstop generally makes it to the major leagues. It kind of depends on how you view Tamar Johnson as whether he's the top high school shortstop. But I think that a guy that's drafted necessarily in the top 10 for high school shortstop, the track record's pretty darn good. Along with that is that he's kind of on the upswing. His athleticism, his ability to drive the ball, his hitting mechanics are very strong. And I just view him as somebody that, man, this is going to be people are going to take this too much of this, but if you told me that he had a hitting profile similar, not the same kind of career, because you can't put this on anybody, but if you told me that some of the same profile was similar to a Corey Seager, I wouldn't be completely shocked. That wouldn't blow me out of the water. And I'm not saying that Jackson Holliday is Corey Seager, because that's an unreasonable expectation put on literally any prospect outside of maybe Wander Franco, who will just be Wander Franco. But there's a lot of similarities in how I could view some of those successes going when Jackson Holliday is in the early steps of the minor leagues. Some of those early development steps that Corey Seager took wouldn't surprise me to see Jackson Holliday take. I don't know if it's MVP level stuff. Obviously, that's unreasonable, but I could see Jackson Holliday take some pretty big steps forward. And I think he's really awesome. I'm debating on whether I'm going to mock him to the Cubs. It makes some sense. But again, early on, any kind of organizational connections are less important than just who are some players that tend to fit certain profiles. And Jackson Holliday fits a lot of those profiles. And the Cubs do look at bloodlines too. They're not alone in that. A lot of organizations do look at bloodlines. This is a fantastic class for bloodlines. So by that I mean players who come from families who were major leaguers or professional athletes. And we talked about Cam Collier. We can talk about, Marquise Grissom's son. Crawford. We could talk about Jackson Holliday. There's just a whole bunch more. And this is a class that's full of it, really. There's just so many in this class. So I think that Jackson Holliday is a guy that's going to be ranked really high. Looking at my draft model right now, let me scroll here. I don't have to scroll very far, but I do need to scroll to see him. Have him either 5th or 6th. Kind of need to parse out a few other things, but in the class. He's really good. I have him with a 55 future performance grade, and I say, like, I lack data on Jackson Holliday at the beginning of the year. I heard a lot of comments that, oh, it's swing and miss. And so when I put him into my rough model to enter the season, he didn't rank very high because of that, because there's a lack of data. Once I started filling in the data and going back and charting his at bats, I was consistently more and more impressed. A 90% contact rate is not easy to do. That doesn't mean that somebody's going to have a 90% contact rate at the majors. That's really not likely. That's more like Nick Magical level. But it's really impressive. And the bat to ball skills, the future power, the position, it all fits for me. And honestly, I don't care that he's a shortstop and the Cubs have a ton of them. There are worse things to have. Like right now, I don't think the Cubs are regretting the fact that they've got Christian Hernandez, Kevin Made, Ed Howard, Reginald Preciado is his full name, of course, James Torontos. I don't think they really care about that as far as like being mad about it. They love the fact that they can play these guys all over the place. So, if you end up sticking a few of them in the outfield, you've got Preciado at third, or you've got Hernandez that outgrows the position, and you've got Made or Howard at short, Toronto is at second. It doesn't really matter. It's all good. If they took Jackson Holliday, I think it's viewing the same thing of we just take a guy that we just feel the best about. And that's it. That's all it comes down to. So I think that there's some benefit there. Right now, I would say he'd fit really well. Would a college bat surprise me? It really wouldn't. And I could see a college bat maybe making the most logical, like organizational sense in the fact that it could be a fairly quick moving group. You've already got some potential superstars in your organization, especially with Christian Hernandez. So offsetting that with a Brooks Lee, Dylan Beavers, Prada, Susak, I mean, maybe Jace Young. I don't know about that. Uh, Andrew Jones isn't going to last that far. He's a high school guy. Trying to think of who else. Jacob Berry. I think his lack of a firm position is going to hold him back a little bit, but he's certainly a prolific bat. And as a switch hitter, I think could be really good. We've mentioned Beavers, Cross. Another guy that I think is going to get some conversation and links to the Cubs at some point is Robert Moore. He's second baseman in Arkansas. I think he's listed as a shortstop sometimes, but he plays second base. And he has a lot of qualities that the Cubs look at as well. Really, he's probably one of the few guys out there that gets like really lauded for his makeup. And he's actually the son of Dayton Moore, the executive with the Royals. But Robert definitely gets a lot of kudos for what type of a player he is. And he's more than like a slappy prospect who just has good makeup. This isn't like Augie Ojeda or anything. He's a pretty good prospect. I'm not as high on him as some outlets, just because, yes, I think he can play some pretty good second base. Maybe some view him as a shortstop. His hitting profile isn't that strong. It's pretty good, but it's not like incredible. I think he's a little bit more contact. There's some juice in the bat. Like he hit like 19 home runs last year in the SEC. So this isn't, let's not knock him too much. But, I don't know at the end of the day if he's the player I necessarily feel the most comfortable with at 7. But it wouldn't surprise me to see him linked to the Cubs because he does still check some boxes. He also fits that, like, the Cubs have generally under Dan Kentovitz taken safer prospects at 1 and riskier prospects after that. And that doesn't mean that that's what they're going to do in 2022, but it's a it's a good way to check off the box of we're going to get a big leaguer. We feel we're really going to get a big leaguer here. And so that could be an easy way. Like you look at Robert Moore and you feel like, yeah, he's a big leaguer. Um, is he a future All-Star? I don't know. And I personally, if I'm drafting in the top 7, want an All-Star. I think that's what most people would view too. But it's all how you create the entire draft as well. We saw Jordan Wicks where I think people felt good about it, but they also didn't feel like, oh man, like this is a superstar that we just got at 21 last year. Kind of hard to do that anyway. Well, Jordan Wicks has taken some massive steps forward, and the Cubs identified that this is a guy that's already really good, but we can do this and we can do that. You know, one of which that we even theorized myself, Greg and Jimmy and Todd all were on the draft streaming show, which was presented by Cubs Insider. And we said right off the bat, like, man, teach him a spike curve, you know, one of the Cubs spike curves, and you know he could really take off. Well, he's done that. He has a spike curve. He showed it in the game in spring training that he pitched against the White Sox. But he's also incorporated more of a sweepy slider. He's junked his 2-seam and he throws a 4-seam now with pretty good ride in the zone. And he already had that lethal changeup. Jordan Wicks was a fairly safe guy that was taken, but the Cubs viewed as, yeah, like he's safe, but we can make him really good, even better. And, you know, maybe they view somebody like Robert Moore that they can do that with. You know, maybe there are just some swing plane changes that just can make some minor adjustments and take a guy who has done fairly well in the SEC, but probably could do a little bit better to, you know, another step forward. So I just think that's kind of some of the considering some of the factors. But overall, this is a class that's really a ton of fun, and I'm just getting into this draft as much as possible. I think that this is just a lot of fun. I'm going to be updating my top 100, top 125 here very shortly, and there's just a lot of talent in this draft. Unfortunately, it's experienced a lot of injuries, and that's been very disappointing. But as the Cubs lead into picking 7th, and then we'll see if they have a second rounder, or even maybe a comp pick, you never know, that there's some real talent that they can get here. If you're a Cubs fan, you don't want the Cubs picking in the top 10, and you'd really love it if they're not picking in the top 10 in 2023. You'd like a playoff appearance. Now, they're not going to get a playoff appearance, I guess win the lottery, but that's going to be difficult too. So you might as well kind of make it all worth it if you're going to be picking 7th. And I think that there are some real players that you can get that worth it and have them be exciting and fun. So thank you so much for the questions. I hope you all enjoyed it. If I missed saying anybody's name, I apologize, but I do appreciate your questions. And hopefully you like that. Let me know what you think about this. If you'd prefer if I just write it out, then I can do that too. But this is a good way for me to just spend kind of an hour just talking to you and letting you know my thoughts on it. For anybody who follows the draft, I just want to give a shout out to some accounts that you should definitely be following. One of them is Mason McRae. I think that he is just one of the best that's out there. And so his is at Mason_McRae, MCRAE. Another guy that I definitely have to give a shout out to, is just so good at what he does, is Brian Recca. He now writes for Prospects Live, but he used to be like SF Draft Talk, and that's like all he did is just a draft for the San Francisco Giants. And let me see, Brian, what is your... Okay, it's Brian at Brian_Recca. I think he's great. If you're watching my stuff and you're listening to the draft and you're not somehow following Joe Doyle, I think you may have made a mistake, or Joe has wronged you in the past, because he's just really one of the absolute best out there at draft content. He's a director of MLB Draft at Prospects Live, which again is another outlet you should definitely be looking at. But his is at Joe Doyle MILB. So Joe DOYLE MILB, minor league baseball. And I think you should absolutely be following him as well. I appreciate you tuning in to me. Hopefully you like what I'm kind of putting out there. But if you've got specific things that you'd like to see more of, or different players you want me to dive into a little bit more, I'm happy to do that. These are just my kind of March thoughts. We just finished our term, and so just spending a little bit of time kind of getting back into baseball and diving into it. So thanks again for everybody who kind of tuned in, and let me know what you think. But otherwise, go Cubs, go MLB Draft, and we'll see you at the next one. Thanks.